His lips found the sensitive skin just below her ear, and a sound escaped her, a sound she didn't recognize as her own, something between a protest and a plea. "Leo, please, we have to stop," she breathed, but her hands betrayed her, clutching at the smooth, taut muscles of his back, pulling him closer. The hotel room was dark, save for the distant, indifferent glow of the city lights painting patterns on the ceiling. "This is insane." His voice was a low rumble against her neck, a vibration that seemed to travel straight to her core. "Insane is how I've felt for 20 years without you, Ellie." He shifted his weight, his body covering hers, a perfect, damning fit, and her resistance dissolved into the crisp, impersonal sheets. She arched against him, a silent surrender, and his name, just his name, was a desperate whisper on her lips as the world outside ceased to exist. But that was now, trapped in the eye of a hurricane they had created. 3 months ago, the storm was just a whisper on a distant horizon. 3 months ago, Eleanor stood in her sun-drenched kitchen in a quiet Connecticut suburb, a monument to a life carefully curated. Everything was in its place, from the marble countertops that gleamed under the morning light to the tastefully neutral palette of the walls. It was a life of quiet success, a life she had designed. Her husband, David, was a good man, a reliable man, whose love had cooled into a comfortable, predictable companionship. Their daughter, Chloe, the brilliant, shining center of her universe, was soon to graduate from college. On the surface, it was a perfect picture, but sometimes, in the quiet moments after David had fallen asleep, Eleanor would feel a hollow ache, a nostalgia for a girl she barely remembered, a girl who had once loved with a reckless, all-consuming fire. The phone rang, shattering the placid morning quiet. It was Chloe, her voice bubbling with an infectious excitement that made Eleanor smile. "Mom, I have the most amazing news." Eleanor leaned against the counter, picturing her daughter's bright, eager face. "Oh, yeah. Did you ace your finals?" There was a pause, a breath taken for dramatic effect. "Better. I'm coming home this weekend, and I'm bringing someone with me. Mom, he's the one. I just know it." A warmth spread through Eleanor's chest, the pure, uncomplicated joy for her child's happiness. "That's wonderful, sweetie. What's his name?" Chloe's voice was filled with pure adoration as she spoke the name that would splinter Eleanor's carefully constructed world into a million pieces. "His name is Leo. You're going to love him, Mom. His full name is Leo Vance." The name didn't just ring a bell, it was a deafening cathedral gong in the silent museum of her past. The phone felt slick and heavy in her hand, and the sunlight streaming through the window suddenly felt cold, as 20 years collapsed into a single, terrifying moment. The hours leading up to their arrival were a unique form of torture. Eleanor found herself pacing the length of her immaculate living room, the soft cashmere of her sweater doing nothing to ward off the chill that had settled deep in her bones. A part of her, the logical, maternal part, told her she was being ridiculous. Vance was a common enough name. Leo wasn't that unusual. It had to be a coincidence, a cruel trick played by a universe that enjoyed irony. But another part of her, a part she hadn't acknowledged in 20 years, knew with a sickening certainty that it was him. She had tried to look him up years ago in the nascent days of social media, but found nothing. He had simply vanished from her world after that last, tearful goodbye before he moved away, leaving a void she had eventually filled with David, with Chloe, with a life of quiet, predictable beauty. She went upstairs to change for the third time. She settled on a pair of perfectly tailored cream trousers and a silk blouse, the color of a stormy sea. It was an outfit that projected effortless elegance, control. It was armor. As she applied a touch of mascara, she stared at her reflection. The woman looking back at her was 42, with fine lines feathering the corners of her eyes, eyes that held a history he would never know. And yet, she could still see the girl he had known, hiding just beneath the surface. A sudden, shameful thought pierced through her anxiety. She wanted him to see that she was beautiful. She wanted him to feel a pang of regret. The thought was so venomous, so disloyal, that she felt a flush of heat rise up her neck. Then she heard it, the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Chloe's bright laugh preceded the ring of the doorbell. For a moment, Eleanor was frozen, her hand hovering over the doorknob. David called from his study, Are you getting that, Ellie? His voice, calm and oblivious, was the push she needed. She took a deep, steadying breath, composed her face into a welcoming smile, and opened the door, and the world stopped turning. It was him. Time had been both cruel and impossibly kind. The boyish softness of his face had hardened into masculine angles, his jawline stronger, his shoulders broader under a well-cut jacket. The unruly dark hair she used to run her fingers through was now shorter, expertly styled, with distinguished threads of silver at the temples. But his eyes were the same, a startling, piercing blue that seemed to see right through the woman she had become, searching for the girl he had left behind. He was looking at her with the same stunned recognition. His polite, ready-made smile faltered, just for a second, a barely perceptible crack in his composure. In that single, silent second, 20 years of unspoken history flooded the space between them. Chloe, radiant and oblivious, stepped forward and hugged her. "Mom, you look gorgeous. I was so excited for you to meet him." She turned, beaming, her hand finding his. "Leo, this is my amazing mom, Eleanor." Leo's mask of charming fiancé was back in place, but his eyes, when they met hers again, held a universe of questions. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you, Eleanor," he said, and his voice, that was the final blow. It was deeper now, richer, but the cadence, the familiar timbre, sent a shiver down her spine. He extended his hand. Eleanor felt as though she were moving through water as she lifted her own. The moment their skin touched, it was like a live wire, a jolt of pure, unadulterated memory. The warmth of his palm, the slight roughness of a callus near his thumb, it was all terrifyingly familiar. She remembered that hand holding hers as they ran through a summer rainstorm, that hand tracing patterns on her back in the darkness of his old Ford Mustang. The handshake lasted a fraction of a second too long, a silent acknowledgement that this was no ordinary meeting. She pulled her hand back as if burned. "Welcome to our home," she managed, her voice sounding thin and distant to her own ears. Just then, David appeared, a solid, comforting presence. "So this is the young man who's stolen my daughter's heart," he said with a warm, easy smile, shaking Leo's hand with a firm, paternal grip. "David Miller. Great to meet you, Leo." Leo responded with practiced ease, his charm flowing effortlessly as he complimented their home, his conversation with David normal, steady, a stark contrast to the chaotic symphony playing in Eleanor's head. As they moved into the living room, the room she had so carefully designed to be a sanctuary of calm, Eleanor felt utterly exposed. Every object, the abstract painting over the fireplace, the curated collection of books seemed to mock her, silent witnesses to her sudden internal unraveling. Leo sat on the sofa opposite her, next to Chloe, who had curled into his side, her head resting on his shoulder. It was a picture of domestic bliss, a future being painted right before her eyes, and all Eleanor could see was the ghost of a boy who had promised her forever on a starlit beach. She tried to focus on the conversation, a polite discussion about Leo's architectural firm in the city, but her mind kept superimposing the past onto the present. She saw the confident, successful man talking about sustainable design, but she heard the passionate teenager whispering dreams of traveling the world with her. He gestured as he spoke, and the glint of a sophisticated watch on his wrist caught her eye, so different from the worn leather band he used to wear. He was a stranger in the most intimate way possible. He was the keeper of a part of her soul that even David had never touched. She noticed the way he looked at Chloe, with genuine affection and tenderness. And that, somehow, made it worse. There was no simple villainy here, no easy narrative to cling to. Her eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, to a framed photo of Chloe at 16, all braces and youthful awkwardness. Leo's gaze followed hers. He looked at the photograph, then his eyes lifted and met Eleanor's across the room. The polite chatter from Chloe and David faded into a dull hum. In his gaze, she saw it all, the shock, the confusion, the dawning, horrifying understanding of their situation. And beneath it all, she saw the same flicker of longing she felt burning in her own chest. It was not a coincidence. It was a reckoning. And it was just beginning. The transition from the living room to the dining room was a slow, dreadful procession. Eleanor moved with the practiced grace of a hostess, but her mind was a frantic storm of calculations and fears. She placed the roast on the table, its savory aroma filling a space that had suddenly become suffocating. The table was set perfectly, the silver gleaming under the soft light of the chandelier, a scene of domestic harmony that felt like a beautifully crafted lie. She took her seat opposite Leo, with David at the head of the table and Chloe beside her fiancé, her face glowing with a love so pure it was painful to witness. Eleanor poured the wine with a hand that was not quite steady, the dark red liquid splashing into the glasses, feeling more like a sacrament for a funeral than a celebration. "Everything looks wonderful, Eleanor," Leo said, his voice smooth, polite. It was the first time he had addressed her so directly since the initial greeting, and the sound of her name in his mouth, so formal and sterile, was a shock to her system. "Thank you, Leo," she replied, the words feeling foreign, scraped from the bottom of her throat. The meal began, and with it, the performance. Chloe, bless her innocent heart, was the unwitting director of the play. "You'll never believe how we met, Dad," she began, her fork suspended in the air. "I was camped out at the Grind coffee shop, totally stressing over my architecture finals, and my laptop died. I looked up to ask if anyone had a charger, and there he was, sitting at the next table, looking like he'd stepped right out of a magazine." As Chloe spoke, the elegant dining room around Eleanor dissolved. The rich taste of the Cabernet on her tongue was replaced by the cloying sweetness of a vanilla milkshake. She wasn't here, she was 16 again, crammed into a cracked red vinyl booth at the Starlight Diner, a place that always smelled faintly of grease and stale coffee. Leo was sitting across from her, his hair a mess, a smudge of ketchup on his cheek. He was laughing, a real uninhibited laugh, as he stole a fry from her plate. That was their spot, their sanctuary, a world away from the bright, sanitized cafe where her daughter's love story had begun. She remembered the way he'd looked at her over the rim of his Coke glass, an intensity in his gaze that made her feel like the only person in the world. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a potent cocktail of nostalgia and nausea. "And he not only had a charger, but he ended up helping me with my concept for the next 3 hours," Chloe was saying, her eyes shining with the memory. "I was so impressed. He was brilliant." David nodded, a proud smile on his face. "Well, that's quite a story." "So, Leo, Chloe tells me you grew up in this state too, Vance. You know, that name rings a bell. Whereabouts are you from?" David's question landed on the table like a lead weight. Eleanor held her breath, her knuckles white around her wine stem. This was it, the first real test. Leo didn't flinch. He took a slow sip of wine, his composure absolute. "A small town upstate," he said, his tone casual, dismissive. "You've probably never heard of it. A quiet little place called Northwood." Northwood. He had said the name of their town, their world, a word that held the weight of their entire shared history, spoken now as if it were a footnote in a stranger's biography. Eleanor felt a sharp physical pain in her chest. She remembered everything about Northwood. She remembered the tree-lined street where he lived, the creak of the third step on his front porch. She remembered the smell of his mother's kitchen, a comforting mix of yeast and cinnamon, and the way his father, a stern, quiet man, would look at her with a flicker of disapproval. She and Leo were from two different sides of town, a cliché that had felt like an epic romance at the time. Her family was comfortable, established. His was working class, proud. It had been one of the many small fractures that eventually broke them apart. "I don't think I know it," David said, satisfied with the answer. "And your family? Are they still there?" Leo shook his head. "No, my parents retired to Florida a few years back. They love the sunshine." He smiled at Chloe, a gentle, reassuring smile. Eleanor remembered the last time she'd seen his mother, at the grocery store, a year after Leo had left for college on the West Coast. The woman had looked right through her, her face a mask of polite indifference. The unspoken message was clear: "You are not a part of our lives anymore." The food on Eleanor's plate had lost all appeal. Each bite was tasteless, mechanical. She was a ghost at her own table, watching a future unfold that was built on the ruins of her past. She risked a glance at Leo. He was listening intently as Chloe described a recent project, but for a split second, his gaze lifted and met hers. There was no warmth in it, no nostalgia. It was a look of pure, shared panic, a silent, desperate plea for her to maintain the charade. In that look, they were no longer a mother and her daughter's fiancé. They were co-conspirators, bound by the same terrible secret. Leo is just the most romantic person, Chloe gushed later, as Eleanor served dessert. For my birthday, he drove us hours out of the city just to watch the Perseid meteor shower. Eleanor's hand froze, the slice of apple pie trembling on the server. The Perseids. That had been their thing. Lying on the hood of his beat-up Mustang, parked on that deserted lookout point over the reservoir. The scratchy wool of the blanket he'd brought, the taste of peppermint schnapps from a flask he'd stolen from his father, the vast, silent darkness pricked with falling stars. He had traced the constellation of Cassiopeia on her hand and promised her that their love was written in the cosmos, permanent and unchangeable. Now, he was giving those stars, their stars, to her daughter. The betrayal was so profound, so specific, it felt like a physical violation. She felt a sudden, hot surge of anger, an emotion so fierce and possessive it terrified her. She placed the pie in front of Chloe with a thud, earning a questioning look from her daughter. "Are you okay, Mom? You seem quiet tonight." Eleanor forced a smile, a brittle thing she was sure would shatter. "Just tired, honey. It's been a long week." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur of disembodied voices. When it was finally over, and Chloe and Leo were preparing to leave, Eleanor felt a wave of relief so powerful it almost buckled her knees. She had survived. They had all survived. As she stood at the door, watching Chloe kiss him goodnight, a casual, loving gesture, Eleanor felt an unbearable loneliness. This man, who knew her most intimate teenage secrets, who had been the sole occupant of her heart for so long, was now a stranger she had to share with the entire world, and most painfully of all, with her own child. After the door closed and the sound of his car faded into the night, she leaned against it, closing her eyes, the ghosts from the dinner table, her only companions in the suffocating silence of her perfect home. The house settled into a different kind of quiet after Chloe and Leo left. It wasn't peaceful. It was a humming, high-strung silence, the kind that follows a near miss on the highway. David, seemingly satisfied with his prospective son-in-law, had retreated to his study with the familiar excuse of catching up on emails, an act that had long ago become his preferred method of unwinding. Eleanor was left in the dining room, surrounded by the beautiful wreckage of the evening, plates smeared with the remnants of a meal she couldn't taste, half-empty wine glasses like silent, ruby-lipped witnesses. She began to clear the table, her movements mechanical, a desperate attempt to impose order on the chaos churning inside her. Each clink of china on china was unnervingly loud, an indictment in the stillness. Suddenly, the front door opened again. Her heart leaped into her throat, a wild, panicked thing. It was Leo. He stood in the entryway, silhouetted against the dark blue of the evening. "Sorry," he said, holding up his car keys. "Chloe left her phone in the car, and I think I left my jacket." His excuse was plausible, almost mundane, but his eyes told a different story. They weren't looking for a jacket. They were looking for her. Just then, Chloe's voice called from upstairs. "Oh, I found it. It was in my purse the whole time. I'll be right down." David's voice rumbled from his study. "Just signing off now, be out in a minute." In an instant, a window of opportunity opened, a small, terrifying pocket of time in which they were utterly, completely alone. The invisible thread of tension that had connected them all evening pulled taut, threatening to snap. He didn't move towards the closet where his jacket was. Instead, he took a few steps into the living room, his presence filling the space. Eleanor remained frozen by the dining room table, a stack of plates in her hands, feeling impossibly heavy. The grandfather clock in the hall began to chime the hour, each resonant bong counting down the seconds of their stolen moment. The air grew thick, heavy with the weight of 2 decades of unsaid words, of divergent paths and buried feelings. He just watched her for a long moment, his gaze so intense she felt it like a physical touch, stripping away the years, the marriage, the motherhood, until she was just a 17-year-old girl again, standing in front of a boy who held her entire world in his hands. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice low, intimate, erasing David and Chloe and the entire life she had built. "You look amazing, Ellie." It was the nickname, Ellie. No one had called her that since she was a teenager. To David, to her clients, to the other mothers at school, she was Eleanor, a name that felt strong, dependable, adult. Ellie was the girl with scraped knees and a wild heart, the girl who believed in cosmic, star-written love. Hearing it from his lips now was like a key turning in a lock she'd forgotten existed. A hot blush crept up her neck, a traitorous wave of heat. "It's been a long time, Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She turned away, setting the plates down on the sideboard with exaggerated care, unable to meet his eyes. "We've all changed." "Some things don't," he said softly, and she could feel him move closer, narrowing the space between them. She didn't dare look. "I was in the area for a project last fall, so I drove through Northwood, just to see it." Eleanor's hands stilled. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing herself. "I went by the old reservoir," he continued, his voice laced with a quiet melancholy. "They put a fence up around the lookout point. A big, ugly chain-link one. The reservoir." The word struck her with the force of a physical blow. She was instantly transported. She could feel the cool night air on her skin, smell the damp earth and pine needles, hear the distant chorus of crickets. She could feel the rough denim of his jacket sleeve under her cheek and the steady, reassuring beat of his heart beneath her ear. It was their place. It was sacred. The thought of it being caged in, blocked off, felt like a personal violation, a desecration of a holy site. "Things change," she said, her voice tight, defensive. "People move on. They build fences. That's what happens." It was a feeble defense, a statement about real estate that was really a desperate plea for him to stop, to leave the past buried where it belonged. He was behind her now, so close she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. She could smell the faint, clean scent of his cologne, a sophisticated blend of sandalwood, and something citrusy, a world away from the cheap drugstore aftershave he used to wear, the one that used to linger on her pillowcase for days. "Did you?" he asked, his voice a breath of warm air near her ear, sending a cascade of shivers down her spine. The question was quiet, but it landed with the force of a bomb, shattering her composure. "Did you really move on, Ellie?" Her breath hitched. The question hung in the air, demanding an answer she didn't have, or perhaps one she was too terrified to give. To say yes would be a lie, a betrayal of the aching void she'd carried for 20 years. To say no would be to open a door to a place so dangerous, so catastrophic, she couldn't bear to contemplate it. She could feel his gaze on the back of her neck. She knew if she turned around, she would be lost. She would see the same question in those piercing blue eyes, and her carefully constructed world would crumble to dust. She was about to turn, to say something, anything, when the spell was broken. "Okay, ready to go." Chloe's bright voice sliced through the tension as she came bounding down the stairs, her phone in her hand. "Sorry to leave you two making awkward small talk." David emerged from his study, stretching his arms over his head. "All right, all done for the night." The moment was gone. Leo stepped back, the intimate proximity vanishing as if it had never been. He smoothly transitioned back into the charming fiancé, smiling at Chloe, grabbing his jacket from the closet. "No trouble at all," he said, his voice once again light and easy. "Your mom and I were just catching up." He looked at Eleanor as he said it, a quick, meaningful glance over Chloe's head. It was a confirmation. The line had been crossed. The past was no longer a ghost. It was a living, breathing thing in the room with them, a secret that now belonged to them both. As she watched him leave, his hand resting possessively on the small of her daughter's back, Eleanor was left trembling, the echo of his question, "Did you really move on?" A silent, screaming accusation in the hollow chambers of her heart. The week that followed was a masterclass in avoidance. Eleanor busied herself with work, immersing herself in fabric swatches and color palettes, creating orderly, beautiful worlds for her clients as a way to escape the chaos in her own head. She spoke to Chloe on the phone every day, her voice a carefully constructed blend of maternal warmth and interest, all the while praying Leo's name wouldn't come up. But of course, it always did. His name was the punctuation mark in every one of Chloe's sentences, the sun around which her daughter's happy world now revolved. Leo did this. Leo said that. The sound of his name became a low, constant hum of anxiety in Eleanor's life. His question, "Did you really move on?" echoed in the quiet moments, a question she still had no answer for. Then came the inevitable summons. Chloe had her heart set on a potential wedding venue, a historic estate an hour's drive away, and she wanted her mother's expert opinion. "Leo's meeting us there," she'd said, her voice bright with excitement. "He's driving up from the city. Isn't it perfect?" Eleanor had agreed, of course. To refuse would be to raise suspicion, to put a crack in the facade of the supportive mother. And so, on a crisp, sun-drenched Saturday afternoon, she found herself driving towards a confrontation she was desperate to avoid, feeling like a lamb being led to slaughter. She had dressed with defensive precision in a sage green linen dress that fell just below her knees, cinched at the waist with a simple leather belt. It was elegant, modest, and utterly passionless. It was a costume. The estate was breathtaking, a sprawling stone manor surrounded by acres of manicured gardens, exuding an aura of old money and timeless romance. Chloe was already there, practically vibrating with excitement. And then he arrived. He pulled up in a sleek, dark gray sports car, the kind of vehicle the teenage Leo would have both coveted and despised. He stepped out, wearing a crisp white shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms and a pair of perfectly fitting chinos. He looked relaxed, confident, and devastatingly handsome. He greeted Chloe with a deep, lingering kiss that made Eleanor's stomach clench, then turned to her. "Eleanor," he said with a warm, polite smile, the same smile he had used for David. "Good to see you again." It was a flawless performance. To anyone watching, they were near strangers, connected only by the radiant young woman standing between them. But Eleanor could feel the energy crackling in the space between them, the weight of their shared secret. The tour began. A cheerful event coordinator led them through vast ballrooms with soaring ceilings and glittering chandeliers, intimate libraries lined with leather-bound books, and sunrooms overlooking the gardens. Chloe was in heaven, her imagination running wild as she pictured her wedding day. "Oh, Mom, look," she'd exclaim. "Can't you just see the cake table here? And our first dance, right in the middle of the floor." Eleanor would murmur her agreement, offering professional, detached opinions on lighting and spatial flow, all the while acutely, painfully aware of Leo. She was conscious of his every move. When he stood near a window, she noted how the light caught the silver at his temples. When he laughed at something Chloe said, the sound seemed to resonate in her own chest. She watched his hands as he pointed out an architectural detail to Chloe, saw the strength and confidence in them, and remembered how those same hands had once trembled as they unbuttoned her blouse for the first time. She kept her distance, always making sure Chloe or the coordinator was between them, a human shield against the magnetic pull she felt in his presence. But the estate seemed to be conspiring against her. In a narrow, tapestry-lined hallway that connected the main house to the conservatory, the coordinator and Chloe walked ahead, their voices fading as they discussed floral arrangements. For a few seconds, Eleanor and Leo were alone, walking through the dimly lit passage. The air, cool and smelling of dust and old wood, suddenly felt charged, heavy. As she went to step past a heavy oak sideboard, he moved up behind her. "Careful," he murmured, his voice a low vibration in the quiet hall. He placed his hand on the small of her back, ostensibly to guide her. It was not a polite, impersonal touch. His hand was warm, his palm pressing against the small of her back with a gentle but firm pressure. It wasn't a fleeting gesture. His fingers seemed to learn the curve of her spine through the thin linen of her dress. A bolt of pure, unadulterated electricity shot through her, so potent it made her gasp. The warmth of his hand spread through her entire body, a liquid heat that pooled low in her belly. It was a touch that was both completely inappropriate and terrifyingly familiar. It was possessive. It was knowing. As his hand lingered, a second too long, then two, he leaned in, his lips brushing against the shell of her ear. The scent of him, that clean, masculine scent of sandalwood and citrus, enveloped her, making her dizzy. "I still remember the scent of your hair," he whispered, his voice a conspiratorial caress, meant only for her. "Gardenias. You always smelled of gardenias." The specificity of the memory was a masterstroke of cruelty. He didn't just remember her, he remembered the details, the sensory minutiae of their intimacy. He remembered the cheap gardenia-scented shampoo she used to buy at the drugstore. Eleanor faltered, her knees weak, and stumbled as she stepped out of the dark hallway and into the brilliant, blinding light of the conservatory. She pulled away from him abruptly, putting a few feet of space between them, her breath coming in short, sharp bursts. Her face was on fire. She was certain he could see the flush that had spread across her chest, could hear the frantic drumming of her heart. She looked over at Chloe, who was blissfully smelling a fragrant white rose, a picture of innocence in the sun-drenched room. The juxtaposition was sickening. Her daughter stood there, dreaming of a pure, white wedding, while her mother was reeling from a touch, a whisper that was laced with the dark, complex poison of their shared past. She felt his eyes on her, and she knew. This was no accident. This was a message, a deliberate move in a game she didn't know how to play. He was testing her, pushing the boundaries, seeing if the girl he once knew was still there beneath the carefully composed exterior of the woman she had become. And the most terrifying part, the part that made shame and guilt curdle in her stomach, was her body's shameless, instantaneous response. The jolt of electricity had not been one of fear alone. It had been mingled with a thrilling, long-dormant current of pure desire. He had breached her defenses, not with force, but with a simple touch and a shared memory. Standing in that beautiful sunlit conservatory, surrounded by blooming flowers, Eleanor felt utterly corrupted, and for the first time in 20 years, dangerously, terrifyingly alive. The call came on a Tuesday. It was Chloe, her voice a cheerful melody that grated on Eleanor's frayed nerves. "Hey, Mom. Just wanted to let you know, Dad and I are going to grab a bite and see that new film downtown." Super spontaneous. Eleanor's entire body went rigid. "Oh, that sounds nice, honey." There was a pause. Yeah, Leo was going to join, but he got held up at the office. He said he was just going to swing by the house in a bit to grab the draft plans he left on the console table. Is that okay? It was a simple question, but it landed like a lit match in a room full of dynamite. Eleanor's mind raced. She could leave. She could go to the grocery store, visit a friend, drive aimlessly for an hour. It would be the smart thing to do, the right thing to do. But she didn't move. A quiet, insidious part of her wanted to stay. A treacherous curiosity, a longing she refused to name, held her rooted to the spot. "Yes, honey," she said, her voice a hollow echo of itself. "That's fine." An hour later, the doorbell rang. It was a sound she had been both dreading and anticipating with a sickening intensity. When she opened it, he stood there, looking tired from his day but as handsome as ever. He wasn't smiling. The pretense, it seemed, was over. He stepped inside without a word, and she closed the door behind him, the click of the latch sounding like a cell door locking. They stood in the foyer, the silence between them, a living entity, pulsing with tension and 20 years of unspoken truths. The console table with his roll of plans was only a few feet away, but he made no move toward it. His eyes were fixed on hers, and in them, she saw the same turmoil that was raging within her. She was the one who broke. The composure she had fought so hard to maintain finally shattered, and the words came spilling out, laced with a rage born of profound hurt. "Why?" she whispered, the single word trembling with the weight of her betrayal. He just looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Why her, Leo?" she repeated, her voice rising, cracking. "Of all the people in this world, of all the millions of women, why did it have to be my daughter?" He took a step closer, his hands slightly raised, as if in a gesture of peace. "Ellie, I didn't know. I swear to you, the moment I saw you when you opened that door," she let out a harsh, disbelieving laugh. "But you didn't stop it. You didn't end it. You stood in my home, you ate my food, you held my daughter's hand, and you lied. To her, to my husband, to me." She was pacing now, a caged animal in her own home. And that day at the estate, that touch, that whisper, what was that? A game? Are you trying to punish me? To destroy my life for leaving you all those years ago? His face hardened, the calm mask finally slipping. In 2 long strides, he closed the distance between them, his hands gripping her upper arms. His touch was electric, sending a shockwave through her. "Destroy you?" he said, his voice a low, furious growl. "Seeing you again is what's destroying me. Walking into this house, seeing the life you built without me, having to pretend I don't feel like my own skin is on fire every time you walk into a room. You want to talk about games? This whole thing is a waking nightmare." His face was inches from hers, his breath warm on her skin. She could see the flecks of gray in his blue eyes, the raw anguish there. The anger between them was changing, transmuting into something else something hotter and far more dangerous. Her own anger was dissolving, replaced by the searing heat of a longing she could no longer deny. "Let go of me," she whispered, but she made no move to pull away. "I can't," he breathed, his gaze dropping to her lips, and then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle kiss. It was punishing, desperate, a collision of past and present, of anger and unbearable need. She resisted for a single fleeting moment, her hands pushing against the solid wall of his chest, but it was a token effort, the last gasp of a dying resolve. Then, with a sob that was lost in his mouth, her fingers tangled in his shirt, and she was kissing him back, meeting his desperation with her own, pouring 2 decades of loneliness and regret into the embrace. He pressed her back against the hallway wall, his body caging hers, his knee nudging her legs apart. It was a frantic, clumsy exploration, a rediscovery conducted at fever pitch. He tore at the buttons of her silk blouse, and one popped off, skittering across the hardwood floor. The sound was a small, sharp punctuation mark in their descent into chaos. The torn fabric revealed what she wore underneath, a delicate, expensive black lace bra, something she had bought on a whim for a version of herself that didn't exist in her comfortable, sexless marriage, a fantasy. And now, the fantasy was becoming a devastating reality. He groaned at the sight of it, his mouth leaving hers to trail a line of fire down her throat. "Leo, no. Please. We can't," she gasped, her head falling back against the wall, but the words were empty, rendered meaningless by the way her body arched into his. Chloe. David. His name was a prayer, a curse. Ellie. He breathed against her skin, his hands fumbling with the clasp of her bra. "God, just tell me you've missed this. Tell me you've thought about it." She couldn't speak. She could only answer by wrapping a leg around his, pulling him impossibly closer. He took that as his answer. The lace was pushed aside, and his hands were on her, claiming her, his touch both achingly familiar and thrillingly new. It was no longer a battle of wills, but a complete and total surrender. The act itself was a storm, as wild and untamed as their teenage passions, but freighted with the weight of adult consequences. It was desperate, almost violent, a frantic coupling against the wall of her family home. There was no tenderness, only a raw, clawing need to erase the years, to feel something, anything, other than the hollow ache of their separation. Her protests melted into breathless moans of his name, a litany of sin and release. "This is so wrong," she cried out, even as her hips rose to meet his every thrust. "Oh God, Leo, yes." And then, as quickly as it began, it was over. The storm passed, leaving behind a deafening, devastating silence. They slid down the wall to the floor, a tangle of disordered limbs and torn clothing. The passion evaporated, replaced by the cold, stark reality of what they had done. The ticking of the clock in the hall was suddenly thunderous. A car drove past outside, its headlights briefly sweeping across the room, illuminating the scene of their mutual betrayal. He was the first to move. He pulled away from her, not looking at her face, his movements stiff and awkward as he straightened his clothes. Eleanor just sat there, the cool air hitting her exposed skin, a deep, shuddering chill settling into her bones. She pulled the ruined halves of her blouse together, a pathetic attempt to cover herself, to reclaim a dignity that was already lost. The black lace felt like a brand on her skin. He stood up, ran a hand through his hair, and walked to the console table. He picked up the roll of plans. He didn't look at her. "I should go," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. He walked to the door, and with one last, unreadable glance in her direction, he was gone. Eleanor was left alone on the floor in the ruins of her home, the scent of him on her skin and the unbearable weight of their sin crushing her soul. The dawn that followed was not a gentle arrival of light, but a merciless illuminator of sin. Eleanor woke with a jolt, her body surfacing from a shallow, restless sleep into the cold reality of the morning. Before she even opened her eyes, she was aware of 2 things: a dull, persistent ache between her thighs, a phantom echo of the previous night's frantic passion, and a scent. It was the ghost of his cologne, sandalwood and citrus, mingled with the musk of sex, clinging to her skin, woven into the very fabric of her being. It was the scent of betrayal, and it was everywhere. She turned her head slowly on the pillow. David was sleeping beside her, his breath a soft, steady rhythm in the quiet room. He was on his side, facing away from her, a landscape of familiar comfort, the slope of his shoulder, the graying hair at his nape. He was a good man, a decent, honorable man who had given her a life of stability and comfort, who had never given her a single reason to doubt his fidelity. And she had, in the space of a single, mad hour, desecrated everything they had built. A wave of self-loathing so powerful it was physically nauseating washed over her. She slipped out of bed, her movements furtive, like a thief in her own home. In the bathroom, she avoided her own reflection, unable to face the woman in the mirror. She stepped into the shower and turned the handle as far as it would go, welcoming the scalding spray. She scrubbed at her skin with a loofah, hard, punishing strokes, until it was red and raw. She lathered her hair 3 times, desperately trying to wash away the memory of his fingers tangled in it, the scent of him that seemed to have permeated every cell. But it was no use. The guilt was not on her skin, it was under it, in her blood, a poison that had no antidote. When she finally stepped out, wrapped in a thick white towel, she still felt irrevocably stained. Downstairs, the house was just as she had left it, except now every familiar object seemed to mock her. The hallway wall she had been pressed against seemed darker, marked by her shame. The living room sofa held a silent accusation. Her beautiful, sunlit kitchen, usually her sanctuary, felt like a sterile, brightly lit crime scene. She moved robotically, grinding coffee beans, filling the machine with water, the mundane routine of any other morning. But today, each action felt hollow, a pantomime of a life that was no longer hers. The rich aroma of the brewing coffee, a smell she usually loved, did nothing to comfort her. The silence of the house was immense, amplifying the frantic, screaming monologue in her head. What have you done? What in God's name have you done? David came down a few minutes later, dressed in his work clothes, looking rested and content. He came up behind her as she stood staring out the window and wrapped his arms around her waist, kissing the top of her head. "Morning," he murmured into her hair. The casual, affectionate gesture felt like a brand of hot iron. She flinched, a tiny, involuntary movement, but he didn't seem to notice. "You were sleeping so soundly, I didn't want to wake you." A lie. She hadn't slept at all. She had simply drifted in a gray, nightmarish limbo. He let her go and poured himself a coffee. "Did Chloe call last night after the movie?" he asked, stirring in a spoonful of sugar. Eleanor's heart hammered. "No," she said, her voice tight. She didn't call. He took a sip of his coffee. "She sounded so happy the other day. This whole engagement has just lit her up. Leo seems like a stand-up guy. I'm happy for her. For them." Each word was a perfectly aimed dart, piercing through her fragile composure. She just nodded, unable to form a coherent sentence, and took a long drink of her coffee, hoping the bitterness would ground her. David looked at her, a flicker of concern in his eyes. "You okay, Ellie? You seem a million miles away." "Just tired," she lied, the excuse already feeling worn and thin. "Didn't sleep well." As if summoned by a malevolent force, her phone buzzed on the counter. The screen lit up with a smiling picture of Chloe. Eleanor's stomach plummeted. Her hand trembled as she reached for it. She had to answer. Not answering would be worse. She took a breath and swiped the screen. "Hi, sweetie." She was proud of her voice. It sounded almost normal. "Mom." "Good morning." Chloe's voice was, as always, pure sunshine. "I hope I'm not calling too early, but I was just so excited I had to tell you. Leo and I were talking last night, and we have the most perfect idea for the invitations." Eleanor sank onto a kitchen stool, the receiver pressed tight against her ear. She listened as her daughter, in excruciating, joyful detail, described a design concept, her words a torrent of talk about fonts and cardstock and color schemes. It was a conversation about a beautiful future, a celebration of pure love, and every syllable felt like a shovelful of dirt being thrown on the coffin of Eleanor's integrity. "So, what do you think?" Chloe finished, her question pulling Eleanor from her spiraling thoughts. It sounds lovely, Chloe." "Perfect. Oh, good. I knew you'd like it." There was a brief pause. "By the way, did Leo manage to get his plans last night? He seemed so rushed when he finally got back to the city. I barely got to talk to him. The direct question was a physical blow. Eleanor's throat went dry. The lie came, surprisingly easy, slick with the practice of self-preservation. He did. He came and went. I was reading upstairs. I barely even heard him. The ease with which she said it frightened her more than anything. The poison was already taking hold, making her fluent in the language of deceit. "Oh, good," Chloe said, completely unsuspecting. The conversation continued for a few more minutes, a blur of wedding talk that Eleanor somehow navigated on autopilot, making all the right sounds of maternal enthusiasm. When she finally hung up, she sat in the silent kitchen for a long time, her coffee cold and forgotten in her hands. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, bright and unforgiving, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Her perfect life, which had seemed so solid, so real, was now revealed to be a fragile illusion, and she was the one who had taken a hammer to its very foundations. She felt utterly, terrifyingly alone, trapped in a prison of her own making, with the ghost of a man's scent on her skin and the bright, happy voice of her daughter echoing in her ears. The poisonous dawn had broken, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that the darkness was just beginning. 2 weeks passed in a haze of quiet, suffocating guilt. Eleanor moved through her life like a phantom, her body performing the necessary functions of wife, mother, and designer, while her mind was trapped in a continuous, looping replay of that hour on her hallway floor. The memory was a brand, a constant, burning reminder of her transgression. She flinched from David's casual touches and found it almost impossible to look Chloe in the eye during their daily calls. Every conversation about the wedding was a new form of torture, a fresh layer of salt scrubbed into her open wound. She existed on coffee and adrenaline, the secret she was carrying a heavy, corrosive weight in the pit of her stomach. She told herself it was a one-time, catastrophic mistake, a moment of temporary insanity. She would live with the guilt, she would carry the shame, and it would never, ever happen again. Then, one rainy Thursday afternoon, her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. There were only 4 words. "We need to talk." She didn't need to ask who it was. Her heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She stared at the message for a full 10 minutes, her thumb hovering over the delete button. Deleting it would be the sane choice, the right choice. Instead, she typed back a single, damning word. "When?" The reply was almost instantaneous. "Saturday, 2 p.m., the Greenwich Hotel, room 712. It wasn't a question. It was a summons. And deep down, in a place she was too ashamed to acknowledge, she knew she was going to answer it. The lie she told David was embarrassingly simple, a flimsy shield for a monumental betrayal. "I have to meet a new textile supplier on Saturday," she'd said over dinner, carefully avoiding his gaze. "They're only in the state for the weekend, and they have a showroom set up in Greenwich." David had simply nodded, preoccupied with a legal brief, and said, "All right, honey, don't work too hard." The ease of it, the trust in his eyes, was more painful than any accusation could have been. On Saturday, she dressed in a simple navy blue dress, an outfit that screamed respectable businesswoman. It was another costume in a play that was becoming her life. The entire drive to the hotel was an out-of-body experience. She was watching herself perform these actions, a detached observer to her own downfall. "This isn't you," a voice screamed in her head. "Turn the car around." But her hands remained steady on the wheel, guiding her sensible SUV towards the precipice. The hotel was a bastion of discreet luxury. She walked through the marble lobby with her head held high, a woman on a secret, sordid mission, praying she wouldn't see anyone she knew. The elevator ride to the 7th floor was silent, suffocating. Standing outside the door to room 712, she felt her resolve crumble. She could still leave. But then she thought of the unresolved tension, of the secret festering between them, and she knocked. He opened the door immediately, as if he had been standing right behind it, waiting. He wore a simple gray t-shirt and jeans, looking more like the boy she remembered than the polished architect she'd been reintroduced to. They just stood there for a moment, on opposite sides of the threshold, the air thick with unspoken words. "This is insane, Leo," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I know," he replied, his gaze unwavering. But doing nothing, pretending it didn't happen, that feels even more insane. Please, Ellie, come in. She stepped inside, and as the door clicked shut behind her, she knew she had crossed the final line. The room was beautiful, impersonal, a gilded cage of muted tones and expensive furniture, with a vast window overlooking the rainy sound. He didn't speak, just took her hand, his touch gentle this time, questioning. He led her to the bed. The frantic, desperate energy of their first encounter was gone, replaced by a profound, melancholic longing. This was not a combustion, it was a surrender. He sat beside her, his hand still holding hers, and simply looked at her, his eyes tracing the lines of her face, as if trying to memorize every change the years had wrought. "I'm sorry, Ellie," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For putting you in this position. For hurting you then. For hurting you now." The apology was the one thing she hadn't expected, and it disarmed her completely. Tears pricked her eyes. He lifted his hand and gently brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, his fingers lingering on her skin. "But I'm not sorry it was you," he whispered, and then he leaned in and kissed her. This kiss was different. It was slow, deep, and heartbreakingly tender. It was a kiss of rediscovery, a conversation without words. It spoke of regret, of longing, of a connection that time and circumstance had failed to sever. When they finally broke apart, the decision had been made, not in words, but in the shared, silent acknowledgement of their inescapable pull. This time, there was no frantic tearing of clothes. He undressed her slowly, reverently, as if unwrapping a precious, long-lost artifact. His fingers worked the buttons of her dress, and as the fabric fell away, his eyes drank her in. He unhooked her bra, the same sensible beige one she wore every day, so different from the black lace fantasy of the other night. His gaze fell to her breasts, fuller and softer than he remembered, marked by the faint, silvery lines of motherhood. He didn't look away. He leaned down and kissed the space between them, a gesture of pure adoration that made her gasp. His hands slid down her arms, then found her waist, still slender, and traced the gentle, womanly curve of her hips. "You're even more beautiful than I remember," he murmured against her skin, and she believed him. He was not seeing the tired 2-year-old wife and mother. He was seeing her, the essential, timeless Ellie that he had never forgotten. He laid her back against the cool, crisp sheets, and as he undressed, she watched him, her fear finally giving way to a pure, undiluted desire. His body was different too, harder and more defined. The body of a man, not a boy. But it was still Leo. This time, their joining was a slow, deliberate dance. It was an exploration of skin and memory, a remapping of once familiar territory. Every touch, every kiss was unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world, here in their stolen pocket of reality. He learned the new lines and curves of her body, and she rediscovered the unique, inimitable way he felt, the way he moved, the way he tasted. It was a communion, an act of such profound intimacy that it felt more real than any part of her actual life. In the throes of their passion, as he moved within her, he would whisper her name, a desperate, anchoring sound in their secret world. "Ellie," he breathed, his forehead pressed to hers. "Say my name. I need to hear you say it." And she would answer, her voice broken, raw, giving him the one thing that was truly hers to give. "Leo, oh God, Leo, I'm yours." Afterward, they didn't pull apart in shame. They lay tangled together in the sheets, the rain pattering softly against the window pane. The silence wasn't awkward or cold. It was a shared, complicit quiet. In this room, they were not a mother and her daughter's fiancé. They were just Ellie and Leo, two people who had lost each other and, against all odds, had found each other again in the most impossible of circumstances. She knew this was the beginning of a new, dangerous chapter. This was the true beginning of the double life, the dance of deceit. As she lay there, his arm draped possessively over her waist, the guilt had not vanished, but it was now joined by a powerful, terrifying, and utterly addictive thrill. She was no longer just a spectator to her own downfall. She was an active, willing participant. And she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she would be back in this room again. The weeks following their first hotel rendezvous bled into 2 months, and the affair settled into a dangerously intoxicating rhythm. The raw, frantic guilt of the first betrayal had not disappeared, but it had been shouldered aside by the sheer, addictive thrill of their double lives. They became experts in the art of deception, their lies to their respective partners crafted with a chilling, practiced ease. For Eleanor, it was a sudden interest in a new evening pottery class, or a last-minute consultation with a demanding client. For Leo, it was late nights at the office, or a weekend business trip that was really a 48-hour stay in a boutique hotel with Eleanor. Their secret world was built in the anonymous luxury of these rooms, a bubble existing outside of time and consequence. In these stolen hours, she was not a wife or a mother. She was just Ellie, a woman desired, a woman alive. The constant low-grade anxiety of being discovered only heightened the passion, a sharp, spicy seasoning on a forbidden feast. They had created a fragile, beautiful illusion of safety and had begun, foolishly, to believe in it. The illusion was shattered on a Friday night in early autumn. The air was crisp, carrying the first hints of winter, and the atmosphere inside the house was warm and cheerful. David was cooking, Chloe was setting the table, and Leo was due any minute to pick her up for a concert in the city. It was a scene of such perfect domesticity that Eleanor felt a pang of something she almost mistook for happiness. When the doorbell rang, she felt a familiar, treacherous flutter in her stomach. He stood on the porch, smiling, a bouquet of autumn flowers for Chloe in his hand. He greeted David with a firm handshake and gave Eleanor a polite, almost distant nod. He was a master performer. Looking at him, so charming and at ease in her home, she felt a dizzying sense of cognitive dissonance. Was this the same man whose name she had cried out in a tangled heap of hotel sheets just 2 days before? Chloe was ecstatic, kissing him soundly and burying her face in the flowers. "They're beautiful, thank you." Eleanor watched them from the kitchen doorway, leaning against the frame, a forced maternal smile fixed on her face. "You two have fun," she said, her voice sounding unnaturally bright. "Don't be out too late." As they headed out the door, Chloe chattering excitedly about the band, Eleanor felt a wave of relief. Another performance successfully navigated. She watched through the window as they got into his car, the sleek, dark gray sports car that was so symbolic of the life he led, a life so far removed from their shared past. She saw Chloe laugh at something he said, then lean over to kiss his cheek before buckling her seatbelt. Then, she saw her daughter's expression change. Chloe seemed to fumble with her clutch, and then she leaned down, disappearing from view for a moment as if she'd dropped something. Eleanor's heart, which had just begun to slow to a normal rhythm, gave a single, painful thud. She couldn't see what was happening, but a primal animal instinct screamed that something was wrong. After a few seconds, Chloe sat up. In her hand, she held a small, glinting object. Even from the distance of the window, through the glare of the porch light, Eleanor recognized it instantly. It was her earring, a single classic pearl stud set in white gold, a 25th birthday present from her own mother. An earring she had frantically searched her purse and her car for just yesterday morning, assuming it had fallen off during her errands. In reality, it must have come loose 2 days ago, in the front seat of his car, during a stolen, passionate kiss before they had checked into their hotel. Time seemed to slow down, the seconds stretching into an eternity of pure, cold terror. Eleanor was frozen, her hand gripping the doorframe so tightly her knuckles were white. This was it. This was the moment the world ended. She could see Chloe turning the earring over in her fingers, her brow furrowed in a curious, innocent frown. She saw her say something to Leo, saw him turn to look at what she was holding. Eleanor watched his face, searching for a sign of panic, but his expression remained unreadable from this distance. Her mind was a white-hot scream. He won't have an explanation. He'll panic. She'll know. She'll put it together. She'll know it's mine. My God, she'll know. Inside the car, the atmosphere had shifted from romantic to quietly interrogative. "Look what I found," Chloe said, her voice light, but with an undercurrent of genuine curiosity. It was on the floor mat. Someone's missing an earring. She held up the small pearl stud. Leo's heart seized. He recognized it instantly. He felt the blood drain from his face, a cold dread washing over him. He could feel Eleanor's eyes on them from the house, a silent, terrified witness. He had seconds to construct a universe where that earring's presence was logical, mundane, and utterly meaningless. His mind, usually so quick and decisive, went blank for a terrifying second before an escape route appeared. He forced a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, that," he said, his voice a marvel of nonchalance. "I can't believe that's still here. It must be Sarah's." "Sarah?" Chloe asked, looking from the earring to his face. "Sarah Jenkins, from my office," he elaborated, the details of the lie flowing with unnerving ease. "I gave her a lift home last week after that big client dinner. Her car was in the shop. She was in a rush, must have dropped it getting out. I'll have to remember to give it back to her on Monday." He took the earring from Chloe's fingers, his own hand perfectly steady, and dropped it into the small compartment in the center console, dismissing it, burying it. The lie was plausible. It was simple. It was, he hoped to God, enough. Chloe watched him, her head tilted slightly. For a moment, she was silent, and in that silence, Leo felt the weight of both of their lives hanging in the balance. Then, she smiled, the moment of tension passing. "Oh, okay. Well, that's good you found it. It's really pretty." She was probably upset she lost it. She buckled her seatbelt, turning her attention to the radio, the crisis apparently averted. But as Leo pulled out of the driveway, he glanced in the rearview mirror and saw Eleanor still standing in the brightly lit doorway, a statue carved from fear. He had saved them, for now. But the lie felt like a cheap, temporary patch on a crack that was threatening to splinter their entire world. Back inside the house, Eleanor finally let go of the doorframe, her legs trembling so violently she had to lean against the wall for support. The relief she should have felt was absent, replaced by a deep, shuddering terror. The affair was no longer a secret, abstract thing confined to anonymous rooms. It had left a piece of evidence. It had a physical form, and it had, for a few horrifying seconds, been held in the palm of her daughter's hand. The thrill was gone, replaced by the stark, visceral fear of Chloe's face if she ever learned the truth. The facade had cracked, and Eleanor knew with sickening certainty that it was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down. The close call with the earring did something irreparable to the affair. It stripped away the fantasy, the intoxicating illusion of their secret bubble, and left behind the cold, hard skeleton of risk. The thrill that had once been a part of the addiction was replaced by a raw, gnawing paranoia. Every time Eleanor's phone rang and Chloe's picture appeared, her blood ran cold. Every casual mention of Leo's name from David felt like a potential accusation. She began to have trouble sleeping, haunted by vivid, terrifying nightmares of Chloe's face, not smiling and radiant, but contorted in the agony of betrayal. The lie was no longer just a weight in her soul. It was a physical presence in her life, a ticking bomb she had willingly placed at the heart of her family. She couldn't eat, she couldn't focus. The dance of deceit had become a frantic, stumbling march towards a cliff's edge. She knew she couldn't continue this way, suspended in a constant state of panic. The stolen hours with Leo, once a passionate escape, were now fraught with a desperate, fearful energy. The question of what they were doing had to be answered. After a particularly sleepless night, she sent him a text, her fingers trembling. "I can't live like this. We need to talk. Not in a hotel. A real conversation." His reply came quickly. It was simply an address. His address. Driving into the city to his apartment felt different from their clandestine hotel meetings. This was not a neutral, anonymous space. This was his life, the one he was supposedly building with her daughter. The thought made her feel sick. His building was a sleek, modern high-rise of glass and steel, impersonally luxurious. When he let her into his apartment, she was struck by how little it felt like a home. It was minimalist and impeccably clean, with stunning views of the city skyline, but it lacked any sense of personal history or warmth. It was a space designed to impress, a beautiful, empty stage set. There were no framed photos, no cluttered bookshelves, no signs of Chloe's vibrant personality anywhere. It was the home of a man living a transient existence, a man who hadn't truly unpacked. He didn't try to kiss her or touch her. He just closed the door, and they stood in the silent living room, the vast cityscape visible behind him, a witness to their quiet desperation. "The earring, Leo," she began, her voice brittle, fragile. I saw her face. I saw her holding it in her hand. For a few seconds, I thought my life was over. Our lie almost destroyed her. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of profound weariness. I know, Ellie. You don't think I've replayed that moment 1,000 times? My heart stopped. This can't go on, she said, the words a painful admission. This sneaking around, the constant fear, it's hollowing me out. We are poisoning everything we touch. I need to understand. I need you to tell me the truth. About Chloe. She finally looked him directly in the eye, her own gaze pleading, "Do you love her?" He was silent for a long time, pacing the length of the large Persian rug, his back to her. When he finally turned, his face was etched with a pain so deep it mirrored her own. "I care for her," he said, his voice low and strained. "She is a wonderful, bright, beautiful person. Anyone would be lucky to have her love. But if you're asking if I love her the way a man should love the woman he's about to marry, no." The confession, blunt and terrible, hung in the air between them. "Then why?" Eleanor whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "Why did you do it? Why did you pursue her?" He finally stopped pacing and stood before her, his expression stripped of all pretense. "Because at first I didn't know," he began, his voice raw with the truth. "I met this incredible young architecture student and there was a connection. And then she told me her name was Chloe Miller and that her mother, an interior designer, was named Eleanor. From a small town called Northwood." He shook his head, a look of disbelief on his face. "It was like being struck by lightning. The odds were impossible. And I was drawn in, Ellie. I was. Because she looks like you. She has your eyes, the same way they crinkle when she laughs. She has your smile. Being with her it was like seeing a ghost of you, a chance to be close to a memory I thought I'd lost forever." Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face. "So you used her," she said, the words tasting like acid. "You used my daughter to get to me." "No," he said, stepping closer, his hands reaching for her before he stopped himself. "That's not how it was. I told myself it was just a strange coincidence. I told myself I could separate the two things. I tried to build a life with her, to love her for herself, and a part of me does. But it was always a shadow of something else, a ghost. And then you opened that door, and the ghost was gone, and there you were, real. And I realized that for 20 years, I've just been waiting. I never stopped loving you, Ellie. I don't think I ever knew how." The words she had, maybe, in her most secret heart longed to hear, were the most devastating blow of all. If this had been about lust, about a fleeting midlife madness, she could have fought it. She could have dismissed it as a shameful mistake and buried it. But this was about love. A great, sweeping, life-defining love that had been denied to them and had now returned, monstrous and destructive, to ruin everything in its path. Tears were streaming down her face now. "So what does that mean, Leo? What do we do?" She sobbed. "Do you break her heart? Do you tell her that her entire relationship was built on a lie? That you love her mother? She would never recover. She would hate us for the rest of her life. And she would be right to. Or," he said, his voice quiet, "we end this. We say goodbye, for real this time, and I marry your daughter. And for the rest of our lives, at every Christmas, every birthday, every family dinner, we have to look at each other across the table and pretend we are nothing to each other, while we both slowly die on the inside. Tell me, Ellie, which one is crueler?" He had laid out their options, their two personal hells, with stark, brutal clarity. There was no third way, no hidden path to a happy ending. Every road from this point on led to devastation, either for her daughter or for themselves. The confrontation she had sought for clarity had only given her a more profound understanding of their hopelessness. This wasn't a fleeting fantasy. This was, she realized with a soul-crushing certainty, the great tragic love of her life, and it was demanding a sacrifice she could never make. She stood there, in the beautiful, empty apartment of the man she loved, who was engaged to the daughter she adored, and felt the full, unbearable weight of her impossible choice. There was no answer. There was only ruin. The confession in Leo's apartment was not a release. It was a tightening of the screw. The knowledge that he loved her, that their connection was not just a shameful, fleeting lust, but a profound and lasting tragedy, offered no comfort. It only clarified the terrible depth of their sin. In the weeks that followed, Eleanor began to come apart at the seams. The pressure of the secret, combined with the agony of her impossible choice, was a constant, grinding force that was pulverizing her from the inside out. Sleep offered no escape, only a parade of feverish nightmares from which she would wake with her heart pounding, the sheets damp with a cold sweat. Food was tasteless, conversations were a fog, and her own beautiful, orderly home began to feel like the set of a horror movie in which she was both the victim and the monster. Her behavior grew erratic, her moods swinging violently between a brittle, high-strung anxiety and a deep, vacant despair. She would snap at David over the smallest imagined slight, the way he loaded the dishwasher, a question he asked about her day only to dissolve into inexplicable tears moments later. She was a ghost at her own dinner table, pushing food around her plate, her eyes distant and unfocused. The web of lies that had once felt like a suit of armor now felt like a straitjacket, constricting her until she could barely breathe. She'd lock herself in the bathroom just to have a few moments alone, pressing her forehead against the cool mirror, staring at the stranger with the haunted eyes who looked back at her. David, a man whose placid nature she had long taken for granted, was not oblivious. He saw the weight loss, the dark circles under her eyes, the way she flinched from his touch, as if his hand were a hot poker. He cornered her one evening in the living room, his face a mask of gentle, worried concern. "Ellie, we need to talk," he said, using the name he reserved for their most serious moments. "What's going on with you? You haven't been yourself for months. If it's work, you can tell me. If it's us." He trailed off, the question hanging in the air, a testament to his own growing insecurity. She couldn't meet his eyes. To look at him, to see the honest love and worry on his face, was to fully comprehend the magnitude of her betrayal. "I'm just tired, David," she lied, the excuse sounding pathetic even to her own ears. "There's a lot on my mind." "Then let me in," he pleaded, his voice soft. "Whatever it is, we can face it together. We always have." But she couldn't. To let him in would be to confess, and to confess would be to annihilate him. So she pulled away, leaving him standing alone in the living room, the chasm between them wider and deeper than ever before. The tension was not lost on Chloe. During her weekend visits, which were now filled with the cheerful, agonizing minutiae of wedding planning, she began to notice the strange, toxic atmosphere that descended whenever her mother and her fiancé were in the same room. There was a hyper-awareness between them, a stilted formality that was far more intimate than any relaxed affection could be. They never stood too close, yet they always seemed to know exactly where the other was. Their conversations were brief, polite, and laden with a subtext she couldn't decipher but could feel in her bones. She started to notice the looks fleeting, intense glances exchanged when they thought no one was watching, filled with an emotion she couldn't name, something that looked terrifyingly like shared pain. The final, splintering crack in the facade came on a Sunday afternoon. The four of them were gathered around the dining room table, looking at floral arrangements. The air was thick with unspoken things. Leo, in an attempt to break the tension, was telling a story about a disastrous camping trip from his childhood. "And there I was," he was saying, "covered in mud, with a raccoon making off with our hot dogs. It was the best vacation I ever had, Elle." He stopped himself abruptly, his face paling slightly. The slip was tiny, almost imperceptible. Everyone agreed it was a disaster. He corrected himself smoothly, but the nickname, her mother's childhood nickname, hung in the air for a split second, a dissonant note in the carefully composed symphony of their family life. Eleanor froze, her eyes wide with panic. David looked up from a picture of a bridal bouquet, a slight frown on his face. But it was Chloe who reacted most strongly. She didn't say anything, but her happy, animated expression faltered, replaced by a look of sharp, sudden stillness. She looked from Leo's strained face to her mother's terrified one, and a seed of a terrible, unthinkable suspicion was planted. That night, the house was quiet, but it was the quiet of a battlefield after the fighting has stopped. Eleanor lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of David's steady breathing beside her a torment. Just after midnight, she gave up on sleep and went downstairs for a glass of water. She was standing in the dark kitchen, leaning against the counter, when a soft voice made her jump. "Mom?" Chloe was standing in the doorway, a silhouette in the dim light from the hall. I couldn't sleep. She came into the kitchen and flicked on the small lamp over the sink, bathing them both in a soft, interrogative glow. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice gentle, but her eyes were searching, filled with a new, unsettling gravity. "You've seemed so on edge. For a while now." "I'm fine, honey. Just a lot on my plate," Eleanor murmured, busying herself by rinsing a glass that was already clean. Chloe didn't accept the deflection. She came closer, her expression a painful mixture of love and dawning dread. "It's more than that," she said softly. It's the way you are when he's here, when Leo's here." Eleanor's heart felt as if it had been seized by an icy fist. She kept her back to her daughter, unable to face her. "I don't know what you mean," she said, her voice thin. Chloe took a steadying breath. "Today," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "At the table, he almost called you Ellie. I saw your face, I saw his face. It was like I'd walked in on something I wasn't supposed to see." Eleanor finally turned, her own face a mask of desperation. "Chloe, you're imagining things." But her denial was weak, unconvincing. Her daughter looked at her, and in that moment, Chloe was no longer a child, but a woman looking at another woman, her eyes filled with a terrible, intuitive wisdom. The final question came, not as an accusation, but as a whispered, heartbreaking plea for the truth she was terrified to hear. "Mom," she said, tears glistening in her eyes, "is there something going on between you and Leo? You seem so strange around him." The question landed in the silent kitchen, shattering the last vestiges of Eleanor's carefully constructed world, leaving her exposed, condemned, with absolutely nowhere left to hide. Chloe's question, whispered in the late-night silence of the kitchen, was a lit fuse. For a terrifying, suspended moment, Eleanor considered the truth. She imagined the word yes leaving her lips, a single syllable that would act as a detonator, blowing her family, her daughter's heart, and her entire world to unrecognizable smithereens. The image of Chloe's face, her beautiful, trusting face, crumpling in agony, was more than she could bear. In that split second, the choice was made. The instinct to protect her child, even from a monster of her own making, was an overwhelming, primal force. A cold, sharp denial took hold of her. "Don't be ridiculous," she snapped, her voice harsher than she intended, a shield against her own shattering guilt. "Chloe, how could you even think such a thing? Leo is your fiancé. I am your mother. The very idea is disgusting." She saw the hurt and confusion flash in her daughter's eyes. Chloe flinched as if she'd been slapped. "I'm sorry, Mom. It's just the way you look at each other sometimes, and what he said today." Eleanor pressed her advantage, her denial becoming a desperate, cruel offensive. "I look at him like the man who is going to be my son-in-law. You are stressed from all this wedding planning. You're exhausted, and you are seeing things that simply are not there. Now, I'm going to bed. We are not speaking of this again." She turned and walked out of the kitchen, not looking back, because if she did, she knew she would collapse. She didn't see Chloe wrap her arms around herself, looking smaller and more lost than ever, the poisonous seed of doubt now firmly planted, watered by her mother's vehement, unconvincing lie. The weeks that followed were a cold war fought in the quiet corridors of their home. Chloe never mentioned it again. She was polite, almost deferential to her mother, but the easy, open warmth between them was gone, replaced by a careful, painful distance. The trust, once the bedrock of their relationship, had been fractured. The wedding plans moved forward, a relentless, cheerful march towards a future that now seemed, to Eleanor, like a beautifully decorated gallows. Every decision about flowers, music, and food was a fresh torment, a new layer on the suffocating lie she had chosen to live. She and Leo had exchanged a single, frantic phone call after her confrontation with Chloe. His voice was tight with panic. Her response was hollow, devoid of all passion. "It's over," she had said. "We stop. Now. For her." There was a long, heavy silence on his end before he simply said, "I understand." And that was it. They were no longer lovers. They were co-conspirators in a lifelong deception, bound not by passion, but by the terrible weight of their shared secret. The final scene of the tragedy took place in the one place it shouldn't have, a bridal boutique. It was an ethereal, dreamlike space, all white lace, shimmering silk, and glittering crystal. It was a temple dedicated to hope, purity, and new beginnings, and Eleanor felt its sacredness as a personal condemnation. She sat on a plush velvet settee, a hollowed-out spectator, as Chloe disappeared into the dressing room. Leo stood by the window, his hands shoved in his pockets, staring out at the street but seeing nothing. The silence between them was absolute, a shared void of everything they had lost and everything they were about to sacrifice. Then, the dressing room door opened. Chloe stepped out onto the pedestal, and the breath caught in Eleanor's throat. She was a vision. The dress was simple, classic, an elegant column of ivory silk that seemed to glow from within. It fit her perfectly, accentuating her youth, her beauty, her radiant, innocent happiness. She turned to the three-way mirror, a slow, wondrous smile spreading across her face. "Oh," she breathed. "Mom, what do you think?" Eleanor looked at her daughter, her perfect, beautiful daughter, standing on the precipice of a life she had fought so hard to protect, and she felt a love so fierce and so total it was an agony. In that moment, she knew with a soul-deep certainty that she had made the only choice she ever could. She would burn in any hell necessary to preserve that smile on her daughter's face. She would gladly condemn herself and Leo to a lifetime of silent, polite torment if it meant Chloe could have this moment, this life, untainted. "You look perfect," Eleanor said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Just perfect, my love." Chloe's smile widened, and she met Leo's eyes in the mirror. He had turned from the window, his own face, a complex mask of admiration, pride, and a sorrow so profound it was almost visible. He gave Chloe a slow, genuine smile. "She's right," he said, his voice husky. "You're the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." As Chloe turned back to the mirror, spinning slowly, lost in the magic of the moment, Leo took a single, quiet step back so that he was standing beside the settee, beside Eleanor. And then, under the cover of their shared adoration for the bride-to-be, he did something that shattered Eleanor's fragile composure forever. His hand found hers. It was a movement so subtle, so slight, that no one would ever have noticed. His fingers brushed against hers, and then, slowly, deliberately, intertwined. He gave her hand a single, desperate squeeze. It wasn't a gesture of passion, but of shared damnation. It was a final, silent acknowledgement of their doomed love, a sealing of their terrible pact. It was goodbye. It was forever. Eleanor stared straight ahead at her radiant daughter, a perfect, serene smile fixed on her own lips. She felt the impossible warmth of Leo's hand locked with hers. She saw the innocent joy on her child's face, and in the space between those two irreconcilable truths, she accepted her fate. Her face was a placid mask of maternal love, but in her eyes, if anyone had looked close enough, they would have seen the silent, unending scream of a soul trapped in a beautiful, gilded cage for the rest of its life.